It's a very beautiful Saturday morning. Hello and welcome to China Now with me, Makiza Latifa. We begin with China Currents, where we bring you the stories shaping China's role in today's global landscape. In this episode, we look at how Japanese and American AI companies have become entangled in plagiarism controversies involving China's DeepSeek, raising fresh questions about innovation and intellectual property in the tech space. We also explore a major shift in the global auto industry as Chinese car brands overtake Japan in worldwide sales for the first time. And we take a closer look at the latest round of trade talks between China and the United States as both sides navigate a complex economic relationship. These stories and many more are coming up here on China Currents. Let's get started.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's China Currents. In this episode, you'll see how Japanese and American AI companies got caught up in some rather scandalous plagiarism involving China's DeepSeek, how Chinese car brands have overtaken those of Japan in global sales for the first time, and the latest round of trade talks, our favorite kind of talks, between the US and China. Let's start with the most dramatic story of the week in global tech. On March 17th, Japanese internet giant Rakuten unveiled an AI model called Rakuten AI 3.0, boosting roughly 700 billion parameters. They called it the largest and most powerful Japanese AI. However, that very same afternoon, when a developer opened a basic settings file for the new model, what they found was rather weird. Right there in the file, the model type was listed as, quote, DeepSeek-V3, and the architecture was labeled, quote, DeepSeek V3 for casual LM. In plain English, that's for the initiated. Me, myself, I have to rely on the enlightened colleagues. But it means the so-called Japanese super AI was actually built on DeepSeek V3, an open source model that was made in China. A closer look confirmed it. All the key technical specs, the layer sizes, the number of expert modules, the structure, all matched DeepSeek V3 exactly. Remember that 700 billion parameters? It was just DeepSeek V3's 681 billion rounded up. Now, to be clear, DeepSeek V3 is released under the MIT license. It's one of the most open licenses in the tech world, meaning anyone can use it, modify it, or even sell products based on it. The only rule, the one absolute minimum, is that you keep the original creator's name and license notice attached. Using an open source model as a starting point and then customizing it is completely normal in the AI industry. If Rakuten had simply said, we took DeepSeek V3 and optimized it for Japanese, nobody would have batted an eye. But that's not what they did. In every press release, every product description, every media interview, Rakuten never once mentioned the word DeepSeek. They only vaguely said the model incorporated the best of the open source community, leaving everyone to assume it was built from scratch in Japan. What made the developer community even angrier was this. When Rakuten uploaded the model, they had deliberately removed DeepSeek's original license file and replaced it with a different one under their own name. In the open source world, this is known as license washing, making someone else's work look like your own on paper. It was only after the community caught them red-handed that Rakuten quietly added back a notice crediting DeepSeek. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Rakuten AI 3.0 was developed with the support from GENIAC. It's a program run by Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. You get what it is. It was funded by the Japanese taxpayers with the explicit goal of building Japan's homegrown AI. Instead, what they got was a Chinese open source model with a Japanese language layer on top, repackaged as Japan's most powerful AI. Back in early 2025, when DeepSeek first took the world by storm, Japanese media called it the black ships of AI, a reference to the American warships that forced open Japan's borders in 1853. The Japanese government quickly warned civil servants to avoid using DeepSeek. Toyota, Mitsubishi, and other major corporations banned it internally, citing security concerns. And now, the very AI model that Japan spent public money to develop turned out to be built on top of the exact same Chinese technology that had warned everyone to stay away from. This wasn't just a corporate embarrassment, it revealed something much bigger. China's influence in the open source AI world has grown so deep that even its competitors can't build without it. And as if to prove the point, almost the exact same drama played out in Silicon Valley that very same week. On March 19th, Cursor, an American AI coding tool valued at $29.3 billion, launched a new model called Composer 2. In their announcement, Cursor claimed it outperformed Cloud Opus 4.6 in coding tasks at just 1/10 the price. They made a point of saying the improvement came from continued pre-training and reinforcement learning. For a company with over 1 million daily users, this was supposed to be a major milestone, proof that Cursor could build its own AI, not just rely on others. That narrative, well, lasted less than 24 hours. A developer named Finn was testing Cursor's programming interface when something unexpected popped up. The model's internal ID read Kimmy. Well, even I know this. That meant Composer 2 would probably build on Kimmy K2.5, an open source model from Moonshot AI, a Chinese company with some extra training on top. The reaction was swift. Moonshot AI's head of pre-training ran his own tests and confirmed that Composer 2's internal text processing system was identical to Kimmy's. He publicly asked Cursor's co-founder, "Why didn't you follow the license terms?" The debate exploded across tech forums worldwide. Even Elon Musk weighed in, commenting simply, "It's Kimmy 2.5. But then came the twist. Kimmy's official account released a statement clarifying that Cursor had actually obtained a legitimate commercial license to use Kimmy K2.5. Kimmy said they were proud to see their model being put to good use. Cursor's co-founder, Eamon Sanger, admitted that not mentioning the Kimmy Foundation in their blog post was a miss and promised to do better the next time. But here's the thing. This wasn't Cursor's first time in this kind of trouble. Back in October 2025, when they released Composer 1, developers around the world noted something strange. The code it generated kept including comments written in Chinese. Investor posted screenshots, calling it proof that Composer 1 was fine-tuned on a Chinese open source model. Later, reports confirmed that both Cursor and another coding tool called Windsurf was indeed using Chinese models. Windsurf openly admitted it was using GLM, made by the Chinese company Zhipu AI. But Cursor refused to say anything. They quietly released Composer 1.5 and moved on. This time, with Composer 2, history repeated itself. If that developer hadn't caught Kimmy in the code, the secret would probably still be hidden. From Rakuten to Cursor, 2 different countries, 2 different companies, but the same underlying story. Chinese open source AI models have become a kind of invisible infrastructure for the entire global industry, and China's rising competitiveness isn't limited to AI. The next story, also reported by Japanese media, is about another historic overtaking. No pun intended, this time in the auto industry. On March 21st, the Nikkei published data confirming a landmark shift. In 2025, Chinese car brands outsold Japanese automakers globally for the first time, claiming the #1 spot. This ended a streak that had lasted 25 years, since the year 2000. The numbers tell a clear story. Chinese automakers sold close to 27 million vehicles worldwide in 2025, up about 10% from the year before. Japanese automakers sold around 25 million, slightly down. Among the world's top 20 car makers, 6 are now Chinese, including BYD, Geely, and Chang'an. That's one more than Japan's 5, and the all 6 posted growth of 7% or higher. BYD led the charge. It sold 4.6 million cars in 2025, passing Ford and overtaking Tesla as the world's top-selling electric vehicle brand. For the first time, BYD sold over 1 million cars outside China. Its vehicles are now available in 119 countries and regions. Geely also had a strong year, with sales up 23% to 4.11 million units. Japanese automakers, meanwhile, are under pressure across the board. Apart from Toyota and Suzuki, every major Japanese brand saw sales decline. Honda had the biggest drop among the top 20, falling 8%. In China alone, Honda's sales plunged 24%. Nissan didn't fare much better. Sales fell 4%, and the company dropped out of the global top 10 for the first time since 2004. For context, the global car market used to be a two-way race between Japan and the United States. Japanese car makers hit a peak of nearly 30 million units in 2018. As recently as 2022, they still led Chinese brands by about 8 million cars. That entire gap was erased in just 3 years. It's a speed of change rarely seen in industrial history. Exciting news also came from space this week. On March 22nd, China successfully launched a batch of satellites known as the Weili Space Group 02. The Weili space satellite system is designed to boost the accuracy of China's Beidou navigation network. The name Weili means tiny measurements, and that's exactly the point. The Beidou satellites orbit high above the Earth and can tell you where you are to within a few meters. That's good enough for everyday navigation, but for things like self-driving cars, precision farming, and earthquake monitoring, you need something much more exact. That's where Weili comes in. These satellites fly much closer to the Earth in what's called low orbit. From there, they send stronger signals that update more frequently. Working together with the existing Beidou satellites, they can push location accuracy down to the centimeter level. The full system is planned to include around 240 satellites. This latest launch put 10 more into orbit. Following the first batch sent up in January 2025, the goal is to have about 120 satellites in place by the end of 2026, enough to start offering services worldwide. Once complete, the system will provide real-time positioning accurate to centimeters and timing accurate to less than 1/1000th of a second. Whether it's a driverless car navigating city streets, a tractor working on a field, or sensors tracking tiny ground movements after an earthquake, this technology will make it much more precise than ever before. Now, turning to diplomacy. On March 22nd, Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng met with a delegation from the US-China Business Council in Beijing. The meeting came at an important moment for the trade relationship between the two countries, and it sent a clear signal of stability. He Lifeng said that the China-US relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world today. He expressed hope that American companies would seize the opportunities offered by China's development, and the American delegates responded positively. They said that the US business community is optimistic about China's economic outlook and wants to continue investing and deepening cooperation. The message was clear. Despite ongoing disagreements on tariffs and trade policy, China remains committed to keeping the door open. Dialogue and cooperation are still the preferred path. The China Development Forum 2026, held around the same time, drew top global business leaders, including Apple CEO Tim Cook, further proof that international confidence in the Chinese market remains strong. That's all for this week's China Currents. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you the next week.
And next on the show, we turn to the Thinkers Forum, where we explore deeper historical and geopolitical perspectives. In this edition, we feature Andrew Bachman, senior lecturer at the University of Vermont, in a discussion titled Rethinking World War II, Global Conflict, Historical Legacies, and the Shaping of Today's International Order. He examines how viewing World War II as a broader, more extended global conflict reshapes our understanding of its origins and consequences, and how those legacies continue to influence present-day geopolitics.
It really gets to the heart of understanding what World War II really was. I think there's a traditional sort of interpretation of World War II, which tends to see it as if there were two very clearly defined two sides, the Axis on one side or the fascists on one side, and the United Nations or the anti-fascists on the other side, and both sides kind of line up and the war starts and it's very clear, and then the war ends and it's over. But what I've been looking at and thinking about and researching is that that's really not how it happened at all. That what happens in the 1930s is a series of expansionist measures by Germany, Italy, and Japan in different parts of the world that actually begins with the Japanese attack on Manchuria in 1931. And those are totally separate things. They're not connected things. So Manchuria in 1931, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, the beginning of German expansionism in Europe in 1937, they're separate things. They only really get joined together in what you could imagine a global war, a really integrated global war, by the entry of the United States into all of those different wars in December 1941. That only the United States at that time in history had the resources to fight a really genuinely global war. And only the United States had the political desire, the political will to fight a genuinely global war. And so the entry of the United States, and particularly its capacity to provide economic aid and support for the Soviet Union, for China, for Britain, starts to integrate those different wars in different parts of the world into a genuinely global conflict. So that's a very different way of looking at World War II. It's a very different way of thinking about World War II, but it's also a way, as you point out in your question, that brings the involvement of China, that brings the crisis in East Asia, much more into much more centrally into the story of the global war. I think the whole of the war in China has been, and certainly in terms of how people in the West, Britain, United States, Europe, have been taught to think about World War II. I think that the events in East Asia, the war in China, has been very, very substantially marginalized in the West, basically. So it's not just one particular incident that's overlooked. The whole of the war in China is overlooked to a very significant extent, in my opinion. So the big histories of World War II have maybe a few pages on what happens in China, but it's very marginal to the story. The main story that gets told is about the war in Europe, particularly American involvement in the war in Europe, and the war between the United States and Japan in the Pacific. It's not an accident. Basically, what I've just described about how World War II started in different places in different times and then becomes unified into a world war, that is also true about the end of the war. Often we have been taught to think the war ends very suddenly, particularly with the surrender of Japan after the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It seems very sudden end to the war, but actually, particularly in East Asia and in Southeast Asia, the war doesn't end very suddenly. Fighting goes on even after the formal end of the World War. So, struggle for national independence in Indonesia, struggle against colonialism in Vietnam, fight for the independence of India. I mean, throughout the whole region, big struggles, big conflicts they continue. They don't end in the summer of 1945. That's particularly true and particularly important in China because in many ways, Japan surrenders because of the bombing, because of the American attacks in the Pacific. What happens is Chiang Kai-shek tries to impose a certain sort of government on China, and very quickly, Chinese people, and particularly in the northern part of the country, who have been fighting the Japanese, there's a domestic conflict, domestic civil war, domestic revolution, and by 1949, Chiang Kai-shek is defeated. Chinese communists come to power. There's a revolution in China. So if you think about the importance of that from the point of view of what the United States wanted to happen at the end of the war, what they wanted to happen at the end of the war was a stable, peaceful, Chiang Kai-shek capitalist China. And what they actually end up with is something very, very different. So, because of that history, of the way in which the war ends in China, it doesn't fit the American narrative winning. It doesn't fit that narrative. When the fighting stopped in Europe, the major political questions had basically been resolved, and how Europe would be divided between the United States and the West on one side, Soviet domination in Eastern Europe on the other side. There was still some fighting, a little bit in Greece, a little bit in Ukraine and the Baltic states, but most of Europe, by 1945, the war did stop. And so that created the basis for a more unified narrative of the conclusion of the World War in Europe. In Asia, as we were just talking about, although Japan is completely defeated by the United States in the Pacific, the fight, all kinds of popular struggle, revolution, anti-colonial insurrection continues across Southeast Asia, East Asia, Korea, the whole region. So there is no stability in the same way that you have in Europe. So I don't think it's really quite so much a question of the Nuremberg on the one hand or Tokyo trials on the other, that those trials reflected a deeper reality of the way in which the war ended in a much more clear and solid way in Europe than it does in Asia. For its own reasons, the United States has much less interest in prosecuting war crime in Japan than it does in Germany. I mean, in Germany, it's done with the British, with the Soviet Union. I don't want to say that it's very much, there's a big element of theater in the public way the trials are organized. And for various reasons, the United States does not respond to the Japanese war crimes. It doesn't want to make a public issue of them. The Americans want to keep the Japanese emperor, want to keep Hirohito in the center of the government, in the post-war government. So the instability in East Asia and the stability in Europe lead to different kinds of political outcomes, I would say. I think the most important thing in terms of establishing the post-war order, which were initiatives taken by the United States. So number one was the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 that established a new global economic system. It established the dollar as the principal currency of global trade. It established free trade as a principle of global exchange. And then second was the establishment of the United Nations in the summer and fall of 1945, which envisaged the world as a world of equal nation states, rather than the world before World War II, which had still had the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, was still a world of global empires. So I think that those transitions, those visions, those ways of thinking about the post-war world were actually much more important than the tribunals. But obviously, the Americans, they don't want to present this new world order as an American hegemony. They want to present this new world order as liberal and democratic and free for everybody and all of those kinds of ideas. So sort of thinking about how those ideologies work to shape the global order as it emerges from World War II. And obviously part of the problem is that the events in East Asia don't fit that picture so easily. I mean, because the fighting is still going on, because communists were influential in the independence movements in Vietnam and Korea and Indonesia, the end of the war is much less clear there. And so the integration of those regions into the post-war world is more complicated from the point of view of the United States. And very quickly, the United States wants to use its alliance with Japan and to rebuild Japan after the war as a basis for American power and American predominance, certainly by the time of the Korean War in 1950. and to rebuild the Japanese economy, to have bases of American military bases in Japan and in Okinawa, and so become part of the regional structure of American. China doesn't fit that picture. It's a big problem, and it remains a problem even until the 1970s, because China has its own path of development. I mean, you could have various views about how successful or whatever that path of development is, but what is very, very clear is it's not under American control. It's outside of the American world order. Even when China reintegrates into the global capitalist market in the 1970s, it's on China's terms. It's not on the US terms. It's not on America's terms. It's on China's terms. You can see how the outcome of World War II has long influence into the 1960s, 70s, 80s. I mean, it still shapes that history. Are we seeing the beginning of World War III? Okay, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the answer. But if you were in the world in September 1931 and you saw what was happening in the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, it would have been very hard in 1931 to say this is the beginning of World War II. But when we look back on it, it's obvious. It was the beginning of World War II. The war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East today, the American intervention in Venezuela. When we look back historically, in 50 years' time or 80 years' time, maybe that we'll see that differently. Then as you live through it, you don't know. Are they just separate events? Or at some point, is there going to be a bigger pattern of integration of those crises into a bigger global crisis? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anybody does. History doesn't tell you the answer. History tells you what happens in history. But by thinking about what happens in history, you can help to understand what might be happening in the world today.
And continuing with the Thinkers Forum, we're joined by Professor Alexis Dudden of the University of Connecticut in her discussion titled Why World War II Still Matters, Historical Memory and Tensions in East Asia Today. She examines the lasting impacts of the war's Asian theater, the legacy of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, and how unresolved historical issues continue to shape regional dynamics and perceptions across East Asia.
One thing to think about from the start is there's history and memory, and historical memory and memory of history. And taking those components as separate values is sometimes helpful to understand what's going on. Because yes, there are definite issues, not just within Japan, but throughout the East Asia region and actually throughout the globe. I think of what's happening in the United States in particular. Locally, most pressingly, a lot of these issues stem from misunderstandings, stem from desires to reclaim national pride. And that stems from me or reflects, for example, issues that are happening with the economies of all of these places. And so when there are moments of economic unease, especially among young people who are worried, anxious about their futures, where do they fit in? How will they get jobs? This is a moment that when certain governments, and I'm thinking of Japan in particular at the moment, the ruling party does not really have an organized plan for its budget. It does not have an organized way of shaping the country's future when, on the one hand, Japan is an incredibly wealthy nation. The question is, how is this wealthy nation distributing its wealth among its people? And when people are feeling anxious about their futures, a very clear path for a ruling party to shore up its support is through nationalism and through the card of national identity. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in Japan is a return to using history, weaponizing historical misunderstandings as a way of deflecting from the real problems that are facing Japanese society. And again, that could be said for many countries in the region. But as you say, if people are not understanding what happened during Japan's empire, during the era of Japan's control of much of Asia, because they have not had really good schooling in the last 15 years, then they're easily manipulable by politicians. And so at the moment, if we see an anti-China rise in Japan, it's because the last 15 years of textbooks in Japan have been really inadequate in terms of what Chinese are upset about, what Koreans are upset about, what Filipinos are upset about. And so I think, yes, of course, it's rooted in historical misunderstandings. These become memory battles. And the memory battles then lead one side to want to take pride in their own nation vis-a-vis another. And unfortunately, I think that's what we're heading into again in the region. Yes, there are real potential areas for misunderstanding between Japan and its East Asian neighbors. The touchstones, of course, are the former sex slaves of the Japanese military, so-called comfort women, Yasukuni Shrine, the Nanjing Massacre. These words are almost touchstones rather than actual historical events as far as many in Japan are concerned. Unfortunately, the decade of former Prime Minister Abe's second term led to a real erasure of gains of understanding. To wit, by 2021, the Foreign Ministry website in Japan has erased not only access to the Kono Statement of 1993, which took Japanese responsibility, state responsibility for the comfort women system, and instead has replaced it with a statement saying we can't be sure of the documents. And this is simply not true. We can be sure of the documents. And so the same thing has happened in Japanese school textbooks. In Japanese school textbooks during the first decade of the 21st century, there was abundant information that school children could learn, which was one of the commitments, for example, of the Kono Statement, to teach in perpetuity so that this history would never happen again. But under former Prime Minister Abe's second term, those all had been removed from school textbooks, as have been issues such as the Nanjing Massacre, Unit 731. And so on the one hand, it's not that the knowledge is not there, it's just been removed as officially required knowledge. And that makes it very difficult for the average person to learn or to understand why people outside Japan think that Japan has not done enough to atone for the atrocities committed in its past. And so it's this tension in which a lot of progress was made at the end of the 20th century, and it's all been pulled away during the first generation of the 21st century. And here we are today with a new prime minister in Japan with a known track record of denialism, denying major atrocities committed by the Japanese Empire. And she also has a penchant for speaking off the cuff. I'm not sure. No one actually knows whether her remark about Taiwan last November was pre-thought or whether she just decided to test the waters. But we have a more recent example of her visit, with President Donald Trump in the White House when he casually made a joke about Pearl Harbor. And she clearly had no idea how to respond. And I see this in two ways. One, had she really been in control of the narrative, she could have responded to Donald Trump's crass joke about Pearl Harbor by saying, well, why didn't you tell us about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? But that she did not do. Instead, she stared straight forward, she looked at her watch, and she didn't say anything, which is really interesting because the same thing happened last summer when the Chancellor of Germany visited the White House, and Donald Trump said something equally sort of offensive to Germany about D-Day, the invasion of Normandy in 1944. And without missing a beat, the Chancellor of Germany said, no, actually, that was the best day for Germany because you liberated us from Nazi rule. Which brings me back to Japan because, by way of comparison, Takaichi, the current Prime Minister of Japan's support base, actually still views the invasion of Pearl Harbor, the advance against the United States, as a great victory for the cause that it espouses still to this day, which is Japan did nothing wrong. Japan was liberating Asia. That's their view. And so Takaichi, in real time, could not challenge that view. Whereas 4 years later, Japan was cataclysmically defeated, and she couldn't even bring that up. So I'm sorry if that is too long of an explanation, but it's instructive to see when a leader of a country cannot address the very pivotal moments of their own nation's past. What's important to know is, yes, the Tokyo tribunals were very much an exercise of victor's justice. And so the far right group today that truly wants to overturn the judgment of civilization, as it was called at the time, that determined Japan's war guilt, they have a point. That is to say, when they say this is victor's justice, yes, it was victor's justice. When the United States, for example, in 1946, while the tribunals were underway, wanted to change and issue a new constitution to occupied Japan, the United States flew B-29s over the Imperial Palace just to drive home the point that if Japan did not accept what the United States wanted, it could still bomb Japan, whether it was going to be nuclear or another firebombing, no one on the ground could know. At the same time, and more important than America's threats and power in the moment, the judgment of civilization, the judgment of the Tokyo Tribunal, was precondition for Japan's admission back into the community of nations in 1951 and 52 with the San Francisco Treaty. That is to say, precondition to Japan being allowed to sign the peace treaty and therefore reopen its country to commerce and exchange was an agreement that Japan would accept the determination of war guilt. So all of Japan's post-war economic boom depended on acceptance, ultimately April 28th, 1952, of the Tokyo Tribunal judgments. Fast forward to today, people forget Japan became super, super rich, right? Japan is going to be number one, as former Professor Vogel so famously wrote. But Japan expanded at a speed that was bewildering to post-war Japanese who emerged from the rubble that was their country and succeeded in creating an open civil society with great wealth. That great wealth popped in the 1990s, as we know, and we're now in the third decade of what was supposed to be the lost decade of the 1990s. And so here we are at a moment in which, looking at that victor's justice way back in the past, we weren't criminals, we did just what everybody else did too, becomes a foundational pillar of right-wing or really Japan first, make Japan great again thought. And so it's frustrating because, yes, victor's justice informed how the Tokyo tribunals were prosecuted, but they succeeded at the time by naming several Japanese as war criminals, and that Japan would forever give up the right to wage war outside its borders. in the mix, the Americans made enormous errors in the way they held their tribunals, picking and choosing, often against, for example, other allies' preferences. There's a famous war criminal, a man who should have been a war criminal, Tsuji Masanobu, whom the British very much wanted to bring to trial. And the Americans said, no, his information from Indochina experience is far more valuable to us. And so these bait and switch moments, I think the most egregious, of course, is Unit 731 and the terrible terror unit in Harbin and elsewhere throughout the empire was not something that was properly challenged in Tokyo. In fact, the Dr. Ishii was not only exonerated, he was reincorporated into normal society. And so there are great weaknesses in how the Americans conducted their tribunals. At the same time, it allowed Japan to move forward and regain its footing in the international community, which for the subsequent decades of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and to this day has been by and large, an enormous benefit not only to the region, but to the global community. I mean, it is important always to remember that Japan has not waged war outside its borders as a nation since 1945. And when I say that as an American, that's impressive for a country that has such a standing military, has such enormous economic power, but it has largely used its technology and its wealth to develop its own society again and to share with others. That's because it accepted the determination of the Tokyo tribunals. And now those who would wish to erase that determination are not only ignoring that key detail, they are simply denying it ever happened. I think it's important to understand that the Americans really ran the show in Japan, and there was far less collaboration with other allies in terms of what would be a successful peace in the region. And also, there is a very critical difference always between what happened in Nuremberg and what happened in Tokyo. And that is that Emperor Hirohito was very much alive. And so, from the beginning, the issue of responsibility, the issue of how to define what Japan was anxious or even nervous from the start. And I play this game in class with my students when I ask them, how different would Europe be today if Hitler had not killed himself? And okay, if you want to hold the Nazi party guilty, would that still be Germany? And so we have this thing, even in our language today, we talk about the Nazis and we talk about Japan. And in many ways, that is because Emperor Hirohito stayed on the throne through negotiations with the United States. And it's an enormous block that the issue of war responsibility as such, therefore, has never really, really fully been addressed to the places or the people of Asia that fell under Japanese rule and oppression. And so I think more study of how those differences, and I'm not a proponent of counterfactual history, what if Hitler were alive in print, but I think it makes for very useful discussions because it allows people to think, well, how would the United States, how would the Allies have welcomed Germany back if Hitler were still there? And instead, how do we negotiate a peaceful Japan when a man who was called enemy number one by the Allies up until the moment that he declared himself a human being, January 1st, 1946, and stayed alive until 1989, that's a huge difference. And his family is still on the throne. So it doesn't come down to just one man. And I don't mean it that way, but it has very much, it's held back questions, analysis of war responsibility in Japan to the great frustration of its East Asian neighbors and Southeast Asian as well. Well, I think it's a real issue that's twofold. One, I think, has to do with translation. I think the more people who understand Chinese, Korean, Indonesian, Laotian, all sorts of languages that seem too difficult for the West Anglophone language speaking people to understand, the more that becomes available. My students around the world appreciate individual narratives, individual stories. And so efforts, for example, to uncover diaries, local level, how we experienced life under Japanese rule, that really opens people's eyes to what happened. The other issue, of course, is ongoing racism. Asia's over there. World War II was fought in Europe. That remains a problem. That's the structure of how disciplinary knowledge of the past has been, or what is valued. You know, when university degrees are valued, they're valued from Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, Stanford, and there is, I would say, a natural bias. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the person's bias, but there's a natural bias to go for things that look familiar or seem familiar. And so understanding the Asia-Pacific War as important as the European theater obviously remains a challenge for all of us to get into world history, to make it truly transnational history. And I think there've been great strides in the last 10 years of presenting these histories to what's known as world history. I think the internet is a fantastic method for doing this because students don't, if they're sitting in Boston, Massachusetts, they don't actually know what they're going to get when they ask AI, tell me about World War II. They may very well end up in Harbin moving forward, not only in Berlin. And so that is a positive development. But in terms of what is not understood is China's contribution to wearing down the Japanese empire before Japan declared war on the Allies. My excellent colleague at Harvard, Rana Mitter, whose fabulous work, Forgotten Ally, is really, it's a very important understanding that without Chinese efforts, Japan would have been a much, much stronger enemy to the Americans, the British, the French, the Dutch, fighting in the region, in the Pacific theater in particular. And so we really do need to understand better. And I think it's critical, especially when I step back and think today, from US-China relations today moving forward, it's critical to remember that China was a very vital ally in World War II, something that is often forgotten. And so bringing that conversation into play is important to understand that no, people are not natural enemies. And especially China's contribution to wearing down Japanese war materiel, war potential, was vital to the American and British, largely, ability to ultimately defeat the Empire of Japan. The San Francisco system, and it is a system, is a really powerful imprint that has shaped the post 1945 world order in the Asia Pacific region. In various ways, what it does primarily is reintroduce Japan to the world community as a sovereign nation. Again, its ability to consider itself a sovereign nation is acceptance of the judgment of the Tokyo tribunals. In my own work, I focus particularly on perhaps the most powerful part of the treaty, which is the tearing down of the territorial gains of the Japanese Empire. And it's enormous. But the Japanese Empire was enormous. It spanned from almost the state of Alaska of the United States today, well across North China, come all the way down through Indochina, through Singapore, through Indonesia, close to northern Australia almost. That's an enormous part of the planet. Overnight, it collapsed. And it's something that we always have to bear in mind, that this huge part of the planet disappears as a phantom. And it's often referred to, especially the Manchukuo, the Manchuria component in Japanese is often called the Phantom Empire. And so when I look at the territorial, in the treaty's terms of territoriality, forgive me if I refer to it as evil genius by the United States, but it's astonishing because several territories are named. Often they are named using pre-Japanese Empire terms for them, and they are stripped from Japanese control, but none of them is actually returned to any entity. My work particularly concerns three tiny island groups around Japan that are the contested territories today with Russia, with both Koreas, and with China and Taiwan. And these are teeny shards of land looked at globally. Japan had massive territory under its control, but today it's banking its foreign policy on absolute claim to three pieces of land that almost nobody wants to live on. Take, for example, the territories contested with Russia, the Kuriles, the Northern Kuriles and the Southern Kuriles. In Japan, they are called the Northern Territories. At the time in 1945, when the then Soviet Union joined the war effort, there were 20,000 Japanese settlers living on them, doing mainly fish canning, sea lion blubbery, jobs that a lot of people really don't want then or now. Those 20,000 people were replaced by 20,000 Russians. And to this day, there's contest over these islands to the extent that Japan and Russia have not yet signed the Treaty of Peace ending World War II. In the case of the Koreas, the spit of land that Koreans refer to as Dokdo, the Japanese refer to as Takeshima, the American government completely pretends not to take a stand and refers to them as the Liancourt Rocks, which is ironic if only because the United States maintains separate defense treaties with Japan and South Korea, meaning that in the event of a contingency, the United States has to defend one of the countries from the other. And then in the islands in the East China Sea, which are under Japanese administration, the reason when Okinawa was returned in 1972 to Japanese control, that these islands were left out of that moment is because in the United States' understanding, Taiwan, a family on Taiwan had as much right to controlling them as a family in Japan did. And so the Americans stood back from that moment as well. When I call it evil genius, it's because that means the United States is required to negotiate in each of these moments too. And so the structure of the territory section is really rather alarming because, Korea was no longer under Japanese control as a result of this treaty, but it doesn't say who Korea is actually under control of. And the same goes for each of the other pieces of the former Japanese Empire. And again, these are enormous places. And in particular, if we look at the case of Okinawa, the former Ryukyu Kingdom, which was an independent kingdom until 1879, when the Japanese Imperial Japan overtook it, annexed it to Japanese territory. Fast forward to 1945, the United States arrived and stayed until 1972, much longer than the rest of Japan. But in 1952, when the San Francisco Treaty was coming into play, the emperor was delighted with the terms of the treaty. He wasn't thinking about Okinawa. He wasn't thinking about the pieces of land that are being argued about today. He was delighted and told the Americans, paid a call specifically to thank them for giving him his country back. So from his perspective, as long as he got his four main islands, Japan was Japan again. But the rest of the treaty has left a mess in Northeast Asia because all of the pieces of land are left hanging in the balance of who actually controls them. And that's where we've reached our breaking point. I would say it began maybe at the outset of this century, but specifically since the 2014 new policy by the government of Japan called inherent territoriality, we've seen a very marked increase in standoffs between Japan and all of its East Asian neighbors, precisely because of this new policy. Prior to 2014, at the Foreign Ministry in Japan, there were separate desks to handle each of these negotiations. So that if there were a fishing dispute, for example, in the islands between Japan and the Koreas, the diplomats charged with that particular policy could negotiate with one another, South Korea, Japan. But since 2014, it's all one shape. And so the inherent territorial policy of Japan strings each of these places together. So if you are a diplomat at the foreign ministry in Japan and there's a crisis in the East China Sea, if you need to maybe give a little bit to the Chinese understanding, you risk losing your position with the Russians. And this is a very hardline tactic coming out of Japan. I would describe it as maximalist, going for the largest shape it can achieve. But that's really not what it's about. It's about reclaiming these few scraps of territory from the former glory of the Japanese Empire, which makes no sense when compared to the sheer vast amount of land Japan lost. Japan wanted Jeju Island, for example, off of southern Korea. Japan wanted to keep many of the territories it lost, and it did not. And so it goes hardline today. It's in all the school textbooks since the last 15 years. Students have to memorize this map of Japan as Japan. And so when there's a standoff, for example, with one of the neighboring countries over fishing or over claims to the land, there's now a generation of Japanese that has grown up believing that this is actual inherent territory of Japan, whereas it's an aspirational policy at best. But to me, it's the most dangerous of the historical standoffs or the historically informed standoffs, because it's the only one that people might actually start shooting bullets over. So I think what's instructive also to think about when the San Francisco system went into play, which very much was the treaty of peace in the morning between Japan and the international community. But of course, from the start, it was going to be problematic because none of the areas of Japanese occupation, particularly in Northeast Asia, particularly Korea and China, were included in it. And so from the beginning, there's a sort of an Achilles heel in the treaty, as it were. But what also was not imagined at all was an enormously different China today. And so, yes, we need to understand that China was undergoing a war itself. Korea was at war with itself. But a rich China was not part of the calculus. And so a China with a military that can stand on its own, a Korea with a military that stands on its own, one of the Koreas backed by the United States, North Korea with its own nuclear arsenal. None of this was imagined by the treaty's architects. So playing it forward into the future with what happens in the afternoon of the San Francisco system going into force is the US-Japan Security Alliance is equally not thought about 1945 or 1952 is that the United States military would still be occupying Japan and South Korea today. No one. I have spent years looking, but there is not a piece of paper, there probably will be, but I have not found a piece of paper from 1944 or 45 that predicted the United States military would be occupying Japan 81 years later. And that is in real tension first and foremost to what the United States can continue to afford as it fights new wars. Likely not. But it also does not imagine how Asia would evolve so dynamically in a way that would break the bonds of the San Francisco system. And it breaks the bonds of the San Francisco system precisely because the United States has enabled the denialist fantasies in Tokyo to say, well, we didn't really do anything bad in Asia, so we're not sure why they're upset. So it fuels at once these memory wars with an actual historical structure that now no longer works. And by historical structure, I mean the territorial configurations that have returned territory, but to whom? I have one colleague in South Korea who jokes that with his analysis, the island between Japan and Korea is technically the possession of the United States Congress. He's joking on the one hand, but since the United States is the force behind that treaty, it's something also to think about. Again, not necessarily to put into print, but to raise as an issue. Okay, so the territory is no longer Japanese, but whose is it? And that's where this treaty has reached its breaking point until, and I think it would matter less if the Japanese government would not keep apologizing in fits and starts for the atrocities, because when one politician or one prime minister says something positive, and then the next prime minister says something absolutely the opposite, understandably, people in the region that had been under Japanese rule don't understand what the position of the government is. But in my full understanding of this, it's actually a test by the hardcore right wing in Japan of what the United States is really willing to commit to Japan's security. Are you going to support us, or do we have to do this on our own? And each time Japan tests these waters, it works against the United States' interests for maintaining regional stability. And so it's something that is deeply frustrating as an American that should be paid more attention to in terms of American responsibility for creating these problems. The Japanese wanted far more input than they had, and that's especially clear in the territory section. The Japanese lost so much land, so much property, that had been part of the Japanese empire. Infrastructure. You think of the industries that, especially in Manchukuo in northern Korea, that were left behind. And the territorial collapse, you can notice what Japan was trying for primarily in the negotiation over this rock between Japan and Korea. That's the one that really gets a lot of play because negotiators from Korea, I think there are 8 different versions of the treaty. One names who owns that rock, the other names it to the other side. It goes back and forth, and then finally, it's not even in the treaty at the ultimate end. And so you can really see an American determination to say, well, maybe this will give us a little wiggle room in the future. But that future wasn't supposed to be almost 80 years later. That's where this needs to have been addressed a generation ago. It was not. The American policy is let them figure it out for themselves, which is pretty racist in of itself. But it's also impossible since the Americans drafted the treaty. They have to be included in the room, and it's not something for them to fight on their own. It needs informed discussion. I don't think the Americans should not be the third party negotiator. Sometimes I think that would be, if there were a contentious divorce, that would be sort of like having the mistress negotiate the divorce contract. I think instead there needs to be a more multinational approach. Maybe European states, some have offered to help because they've had territorial disputes. I think, another thing to consider is that precondition to membership in NATO is no a territorial dispute with your border. I mean, excuse me, no border dispute with your neighboring countries. And meanwhile, Japan has border disputes with all of its neighbors. And it's a different way to think about this island nation floating in the Pacific, that it has deeply unstable borders with Russia, the Koreas, China, and Taiwan. And precisely because of the inadequacy or the vagueness of the San Francisco Treaty. There are two very clear issues that concern me deeply. One is a potential second use of nuclear weapons against a human population. Using a nuclear weapon in war is an unthinkable it's an unthinkable path forward because it is unwinnable. The weapons weapons that large nations possess today are so much larger than the weapons used against civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that it would devastate the planet in a way that we can't imagine. So we must not consider the use of nuclear weapons. And a lot of that stems from the United States' inability to grapple with its own use of those weapons on civilians. There's a reason, for example, that among weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons remain legal as an option, unlike biological and chemical warfare, which have been outlawed. Nuclear weapons are legal weapons of mass destruction. And I think that that really needs to be challenged before we destroy ourselves. And I don't mean to sound so Armageddon about it, but it does give me great pause. The second issue is that studying history is not an afterthought. It's not background music to the present. And when politicians or thought leaders weaponize the past, events that happened in the past for present political purposes, not only are they playing with fire, but they're oftentimes re-victimizing survivors of these atrocities. And so rather than let examples from history be sort of empty words. When someone in Japan wants to say that the Nanjing massacre is a fabrication, that it's all made up, that's an act of violence as far as I'm concerned. In the United States, when people say it wasn't so bad for the slaves, it's an act of violence to the survivors or the descendants of the survivors of those atrocities. And so words cannot be thrown around to weaponize the past. And I think actually instructive is to pay more attention to Japan's former Prime Minister Ishiba, who resigned just prior to Takaichi's victory. Ishiba was last August, on the 80th anniversary of the end of the war, was widely expected to make a new speech representing what Japan really now thought today. And he'd been rumored to make this speech because he felt profoundly and had gone on record saying he was aware that this was probably the last major anniversary where a few survivors could still hear these words before they died. He said nothing, ultimately. He did return to the 2012 language of Japan will not wage war again, but he was so pressured by expectation from the one hand and being just bullied by the party that's now in power on the other hand, for saying anything truthful about Japan's past would be seen as an act of treason as far as they're concerned. And so thinking about how he chose just to stand back, honor the dead, and move forward suggests that sometimes not saying anything at all is smart in this region, while so much is still really tense in the present. So I am of several minds, because as a history teacher, obviously you just confront what happened and you tell the truth. If you're a politician and you know that this is a memory battle, not an argument about whether this document is real or not, but if you're fighting over, we were great once, we'll be great again, then sometimes it's wiser not to say anything at all.
And that brings us to the end of this week's China Now. Today, we brought you the latest developments in China currents and explore the lasting global impact of history through our Thinkers Forum segments. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do remember to send in your comments, your thoughts, feedback, and suggestions through the email provided below. I am Makiza Latifa, and I'll see you same time next week.